Okay. Good evening and welcome everyone here in the upper house and to everyone joining us online. I hope you can all hear me. It's a real pleasure, like a real pleasure, to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Lorenzo Calvelli. Lorenzo's research centers on classical and late antique epigraphy, the history of the Mediterranean, and the transmission, interpretation, and preservation of antiquity from late antiquity through the early modern period, and also works on antiquarian collections in Venice and Rome, and of course on the reception of antiquity. He did not tell me any of that, so I hope I haven't told any lies. He is the author of numerous scholarly publications, and he's pretty greedy about this. He's had at least two edited volumes this year, which is ridiculous, within close succession of each other. One is on writing and religious traditions in the ancient Western Mediterranean, which he's a co-editor, and he's got another co-edited volume this year also, entitled A Land for Strangers, Non-Native Individuals and Communities in Cyprus. And it's lovely to see some of our Cypriot colleagues here as well today. So both of these volumes have been out in 2025. He's also got umpteen articles and book chapters as well. And it's also interesting to see on his huge list of publications, which go on for pages, that much of the work that he's done is in collaboration with other people. And I think that is reflective of his very generous nature too. He's spent a huge amount of time working abroad, which is bizarre considering his home university is in Venice. But he's been a Marie Curie graduate student at the University College London. He earned a PhD thanks to a coetal between Venice and Paris. He's been a postdoctoral fellow at the Warwick Institute in London, in Florence at the Harvard Center for Italian Renaissance Studies. And also were you in Princeton as well? In Princeton too. He's the author of many different contributions, as we said earlier on, including his own volume from 2009. Is that right? Which I'm not even going to pretend to pronounce, but he might talk about it later on. Lorenzo is one of our two visiting fellows this year, and he and his partner in crime, Professor Nicoletta Momigliano, have been the heart and soul of the BSA this year. And although Nico has already left, Lorenzo has been keeping their Negroni making alive, but soon he will leave too, and we will be bereft of Negronis, but we'll also miss Lorenzo. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for your very generous introduction, and above all for warning the audience that for better or for worse, anything that follows will be to the credit of our Negroni nights. So, a strange vagabond genius, half enthusiast, half rogue, who wandered all over Italy and the East, sweeping into his net every alleged relic of antiquity he could lay his hands on. This is how an anonymous but remarkably well-phrased entry in the 1872 issue of the Edinburgh Review describes Cyriac of Ancona. More than 150 years later, Cyriac remains one of the most complex and intriguing figures of European culture. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he was not just a humanist devoted to philological investigations. In the first place, he was a merchant and a fine diplomat, a very pragmatic individual who was well accustomed to traveling by sea and by land. His interest in the ancient world was far from theoretical. It was shaped by direct engagement with the physical remnants of the past that he encountered along the Mediterranean shores, primarily during his commercial journeys. Cyriac's character was remarkably eclectic, and it is fair to say that his approach to classical antiquity was happily free, happily devoid from the later superstructures imposed upon it during the Renaissance. During his lifetime, the whole of Cyriac's intellectual endeavor flowed into what he himself called the Commentaria de rebus antiquis, his commentaries on ancient matters. This was a monumental corpus of travel journals conceived to accommodate copies of the most significant ancient monuments that he observed during his peregrinations. The scale of this undertaking far exceeded that of simple notebooks or diaries. Using his elegant and highly recognizable humanistic script, Cyriac transcribed not only epigraphic texts, but also reproduced, through precise drawings, the material features of monuments and their iconographic elements. Unlike most humanists, such as Poggio Bracciolini or other refined members of the Florentine circle, Cyriac did not generally seek to interpret the remains of antiquity. Rather, he confined himself to reproducing them with an almost photographic precision. His attitude reflected a candid gaze, almost that of a 15th century Herodotus from Ancona. At the same time, however, it revealed a striking modernity. Cyriac was not interested solely in texts, but he approached monuments in their entirety. This distinctive way of engaging with antiquity explains why he is often regarded as a pioneer of modern archaeology and epigraphy. In my presentation today, I should like first to offer an overview of the Commentaria, sharing some new pieces of information in order to clarify both their significance and their fate. This first part will provide the necessary framework for a better understanding of the context of Cyriac's first visit to Athens and of the project that I am currently developing here at the British School. Scholars estimate that throughout his life, Cyriac transcribed over 1,000 ancient monuments, most of which were inscriptions that are now lost. Unfortunately, the exact number of items recorded in the Commentaria remains unknown because this crucial work has not been preserved in its entirety. What survives in Cyriac's own hand is extremely little and amounts to a few dozen fragmentary folios, the most remarkable of which are preserved in two manuscripts kept at the Ambrosiana Library in Milan, the Trotti manuscript, and at the State Library in Berlin, the so-called Hamilton manuscript. This latter includes several important drawings of Athenian monuments and inscriptions, as we shall see. After Cyriac's death in 1452, many other antiquarians engaged with his writings both directly and indirectly. In the second half of the 15th century and in the early 1500s, various sections of the Commentaria were transcribed, integrated, modified, and subsequently reworked by different humanists. As a result of this process, the textual and visual components of Cyriac's work began to follow distinct pathways. This divergence has also affected modern scholarship, with epigraphists and art historians adopting different approaches in the complex and challenging task of understanding the original structure of the Commentaria. To quote the famous words of Theodor Mommsen, the Commentaria were scattered to the wind like the leaves of the Sibyl. Mommsen himself, together with other editors of the main epigraphic corpora, such as Giovanni Battista de Rossi or Erich Siebert, devoted remarkable efforts to reconstructing the surviving fragments of Cyriac's work. Today, the most eloquent results of this long tradition of studies are represented by two volumes edited by Edward Bodnar and Charles Mitchell too, published in the I Tatti Renaissance Library. They include the edition of Cyriac's early and late travel journals, as well as that of his biography, the Vita Cyriaci, or Cyriaci, written by his contemporary and fellow citizen from Ancona, Francesco Scalamonti. To these books, we should also add two recent monographs by Michalis Katsidakis and Eleni Tunda, which have significantly advanced our understanding of Cyriac's relationship with the Greek world. As for Scalamonti's Vita Cyriaci, only one early witness survives, recounting Cyriac's early years from his childhood up to 1435. It is a remarkable manuscript assembled copied and illuminated by Felice Feliciano and kept at the chapter library in Treviso, near Venice. A later copy of this work, transcribed in the 1780s and used as the exemplar for the first printed edition of Cyriac's life, is kept just next door, here in Athens, in the Gennadios Library. This manuscript is also extremely interesting, as it bears witness to a renewed 18th century interest in the figure of Cyriac, as well as to the circulation of handwritten materials related to him on the international antiquarian market through networks that remain to be clarified. In fact, we still do not know how Ioannis Gennadios got hold of the manuscript, which was offered in 1922 to the American School of Classical Studies, along with the rest of his collection of books and manuscripts. This slide here shows a few photographs of this remarkable item by kind permission of the Gennadios Library, and I hope to be able to study it in greater depth in the future. Let us now come back to Cyriac's Commentaria, which represent the main source for our investigation. As I have already mentioned, most of them have been lost, but what exactly has happened to them? In an article published in 1910, the Italian philologist Remigio Sabbadini put forward the theory that has since been. Sabbadini was familiar with an inventory of the Sforza family's library in Pesaro, in central Italy, compiled in the year 1500. Among several other manuscripts, this document mentioned the work simply listed as Cyriacus. Sabbadini understood this entry as a reference to the Commentaria and proposed that they had perished in the fire that destroyed the Sforza library a few years later in 1514. Sabbadini's conjecture, which reminds us of the dramatic ending of Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, has been repeated time and again until it acquired the status of fact. In the next part of my presentation, I shall set Sabbadini's view against a group of recently discovered or still unpublished sources with the aim of suggesting a different interpretation of the fate of the Commentaria. To begin with, it is important to note that the Commentaria are not included in a famous list of books belonging to Cyriac's library, which were recorded as being in the possession of his nephew in Ancona right after Cyriac's death. By contrast, the two oldest sources explicitly related to the survival of the Commentaria are in the hand of a Venetian nobleman named Pietro Dolfin, who had the opportunity to transcribe some of Cyriac's orthographs in Ancona and in Rimini between 1458 and 1464. The next reference is very important and has not been sufficiently emphasized to date. It comes from a massive antiquarian work entitled Annales, written by a 15th century Dominican humanist named Pietro Ranzano and preserved, largely unpublished, in the Municipal Library of Palermo in Sicily. Ranzano's description closely corresponds to what the Commentaria must have looked like, since it mentions both transcriptions of text. I've underlined here the most interesting bits of the passage. I'm not going to read it, but you can have a look at it while I speak. So it corresponds to what the Commentaria must have looked like because it mentions both transcriptions of text and representations of monuments. The 3-volume which Ranzano regarded as Cyriac's autographs were shown to him by a prominent figure at the Aragonese court of Naples, an astrologer and physician named Angelo Catone. Unfortunately, Ranzano does not specify when he saw Cyriac's volumes, but on the basis of other sources, it is possible to suggest that he did so between 1468 and 1474. The Latin sentence is ea volumina indelicis abebat could suggest that Catone was the owner of the books or that he held them in high esteem, even if they belonged to someone else. In the latter case, they were probably kept in the Royal Aragonese Library of Naples, of which Catone was the curator. Further crucial information concerning the fate of the Commentaria comes from another humanist of the late 15th century, the Catalan Jeroni Pau. In a short work devoted to his native city, Barcelona, he states that he copied the text of a forged inscription from Cyriac's work. His phrasing is not easy to interpret. The sentence in Latin, ad nos sex haud parva volumina pervenerunt, could in general suggest that 6 volumes of Cyriac's work had survived up to his time, but it could also more literally mean that these volumes had come into his possession. In any case, it seems likely that he had seen these manuscripts between 1475, when he moved to Italy in the service of the Borgias, and 1491, when the book was actually published. So all the documents that we have examined so far are earlier than the hypothetical date of the destruction of the Commentaria suggested by Sabadini in the 1514 fire of the Pesaro library. But it should be emphasized that none of them relates to the city of Pesaro, nor to the Sforza family, which appears, in my view, to weaken Sabadini's theory. The reference to Cyriacus in the inventory of the Sforza library remains too vague and seems difficult to reconcile with the 3 volumes described by Ranzano, or even more with the 6 substantial volumes mentioned by Jeroni Pau. An additional point that needs to be considered is that 2 distinct sections of the Commentaria were published later in the 17th and in the 18th centuries. These editions, which have not yet been the object of comprehensive study, were based on manuscripts that are now lost and whose origin and context remain unclear. What is certain and undeniable, however, is that significant parts of the Commentaria, or at least copies of them, still existed and continued to circulate long after the destruction of the library of Pesaro. And it is at this stage of the story that Athens enters the picture, making the beginning of the second part of my presentation. So between 1654 and 1664, at the request of Cardinal Francesco Barberini the Elder, his librarian Carlo Moroni, in Rome of course, began printing certain sections of the Commentaria as part of a larger publishing initiative which aimed to produce a new monumental corpus of ancient inscriptions. However, this project was never completed, possibly because Cyriac had come to be regarded with suspicion as a forger of inscriptions. Only a thin folio volume entitled Epigrammata reperta per il Lyricum was printed from a manuscript that has been lost ever since. This work cannot even be considered a proper edition because it lacks a title page, an indication of the publisher, and details about the place and date of publication. In spite of this missing datum, some relevant details can be inferred from a handwritten payroll in the Barberini archive in the Vatican, which mentions a payment made to Moroni for the printing of Cyriac's books in 1661. Copies of Moroni's edition are very rare and present obvious Catholic issues which make them difficult to identify. But despite this volume is an extraordinary source for the study of ancient epigraphy. An important point that needs to be underlined is that the manuscript used for Moroni's publication did not preserve the drawings that originally accompanied Cyriac's autographs and that were essential in the original structure of the Commentaria. This inclusion can be inferred from the recurrent notes indicating the almost complete absence of illustration in the manuscript on which the edition relied. So you can see that the printed edition says des dicon in originale. So the image is missing, the figure is missing. Despite the absence of this visual information, Moroni's book remains a crucial source because it concerns a segment of Cyriac's life which begins right after the end of Scalamonti's biography. The diaries cover Cyriac's journeys through Dalmatian and Epirus in late 1435, continuing across mainland Greece and particularly Athens, in the early months of 1436. They then describe his itinerary back from the Piraeus to Venice in the spring of 1436. The following year, Cyriac sailed back to Greece and traveled through the Peloponnesus, eventually reaching Sparta. Altogether, Moroni's edition includes the text of 269 inscriptions that Cyriac transcribed during these journeys. The maps that I've just shown you derive from what is arguably still one of the most important landmarks in the study of the manuscript tradition of Cyriac's work, namely Edward Bodmer's incredibly rich volume Syriacus of Ancona and Athens, published in Brussels in 1960. Although Bodmer's initial aim was to verify the accuracy of some of the transcriptions that Cyriac produced during his stay here in Athens, his study extended far beyond this objective. In many respects, it represents the first modern attempt to consider Cyriac's engagement with antiquity as a whole and to examine the epigraphic evidence on which his work relied. By working primarily at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton and without leaving the United States, Bodmer produced an extraordinary piece of philological scholarship, which in many respects remains unsurpassed today. His study demonstrated with great clarity that many of the errors traditionally attributed to Cyriac did not in fact originate with him, but arose with the manuscript tradition that transmitted his work. Bodmer also played a crucial role in restoring Cyriac's reputation as a fundamentally reliable witness. It is evident that Cyriac neither fabricated texts nor claimed to have seen inscriptions that did not exist. But despite the enduring value of Bodmer's remarkable book, exactly 60 years after its publication, it is now time to reconsider the relationship between Cyriac and Athens. In the first place, this is worth doing because in the meantime, our knowledge of Athens and of its epigraphic heritage has expanded enormously. To give but one example, Bodmer could refer to just one single article on Byzantine Athens, whereas current scholarship now benefits from a wide range of detailed studies on the city's topography in that period, and including major works on the Acciaioli, the Florentine family who governed the Duchy of Athens. Secondly, the digitization of manuscripts now makes it possible to collate documents that Bodmer was unable to consult directly, at least before the book was printed. In addition, we now have access to improved critical edition of many inscriptions, as well as digital resources such as the Attic inscriptions online or the epigraphic landscape of Athens. For the purposes of my project, I've chosen to take as my starting point the edition of the Commentaria published in Rome by Moroni, the Barberini librarian. This work includes 52 inscriptions transcribed from the copies made by Cyriac during his first stay in Athens between the 7th and 22 of April of 1436. Let us now follow Cyriac's footsteps on a journey that will take us back to the city that he visited almost 600 years ago. The first impression of Athens recorded by Cyriac aligns with a well-established topos of humanist literature, that of contemplating ancient cities through their ruins. As Petrarch and Bracciolini did for Rome, Cyriac highlights the contrast between the majesty of marble buildings and the desolation of the landscape in which the past grandeur of the city is reflected in present decay. Beyond this commonplace, the expression peragros, which you can read here in this passage, the translations are all mine, I hope they're fairly understandable. The expression peragros is particularly significant, evoking Athens reduced to fields surrounding the area where the great urban complex had once stood. During his stay in Athens, Cyriac was hosted by a certain Antonello Balduino, an Italian who lived on the Acropolis. The Commentaria preserve the memory of this, since they mention an inscription located near the house of this man, which was visible until recently between the Erecteion and the north wall of the Acropolis, and is now in the Acropolis Museum. As one might expect, from the very beginning of his exploration of the city's antiquities, Cyriac was particularly struck by the Parthenon, to which he devoted a brief yet fairly precise description. In Moroni's edition, this description is presented separately from the section devoted to Athenian inscriptions. But thanks to one of the few surviving autographs of Cyriac, the Hamilton manuscript in Berlin, which I mentioned, we are fortunate enough to know that in the original version, this passage served as the caption to Cyriac's famous drawing of the Parthenon. This is a rather accurate reproduction of the west side of the temple, even if, as Mary Beard aptly put it, the figure of Athena in the pediment looks more, quote, like a 15th century lady dealing with a pair of troublesome horses backed up by a chorus of Renaissance putti. End of quote. Cyriac's drawing was also reproduced by the Renaissance architect Giuliano da Sangallo in his famous sketchbook kept at the Vatican Library. Sangallo also includes a drawing of the metope, which is missing from the Berlin's manuscript, but interestingly transforms the Doric capitals of the Parthenon into Ionic ones. Despite some inaccuracies, both drawings are particularly meaningful because they show the Parthenon before its destruction by the Venetian siege of Athens in 1687 and before the later removal of its sculptural decoration by on the Acropolis. So we're both to be blamed. On the Acropolis, Cyriac also copied an inscription which once stood on the architrave of the small round temple dedicated to the goddess Roma and Augustus, which was located at the east end of the Parthenon. The text became one of Cyriac's favorites. It is included both in Moroni's volume and in the Hamilton manuscript. You can see it here, with an interlinearly Latin translation in the hand of Pietro Donato, to whom Cyriac had presented the manuscript. Cyriac also copied this inscription into his own manuscript of Strabo's Geography, a fantastic manuscript which I had the opportunity to see in Eton College's library in England. And there he wrote in Greek that he had seen this inscription at the threshold of the entrance to the temple of Athena Polias, which in Strabo would refer to the Erechtheum, although Cyriac mistakenly took Polias as the equivalent of Pallas. After visiting the Parthenon, Cyriac's itinerary led him northwards towards the western gate of the city. There he encountered a Hadrianic inscription near the gate of the Valerian Wall, south of the Stoa of Attalus. Proceeding eastwards, he followed the Street of the Tripods, which was known for the choregic monuments that lined it. In this area, he first copied the inscriptions of the monuments of Lysicrates. The context of the inscription, which is carved with rather thin characters that are still visible today, the context of the inscription posed some difficulties, which resulted in certain errors of reading due to the height of the dedication and to the confusion between some letters. Further on, he saw and copied another choregic inscription, which is now lost. It was noted later by several travelers, yet Cyriac is the only one who transcribed its final line. The inscription was probably located just east of the theater of Dionysus. Above the theater, Cyriac found himself facing the choregic monument of Thrasillos. I have a meeting with the Euphoria tomorrow at 9 a.m. to go and see it, which at the time had been transformed into the entrance to a grotto church dedicated to the Virgin. There he copied 3 inscriptions celebrating the choral victory of Thrasillos and of his son. His transcriptions are extremely valuable because certain parts of the text were recorded only by him and by some other 17th century travelers. Cyriac also noted the presence of a statue of Dionysus wearing a panther skin and tunic, which was placed where the tripod had stood, and he drew it without a head. So the drawing is missing in Moroni's volume, but we're lucky enough to have it in Sangallo's sketchbook to the right. And the marble statue was also brought to London by Lord Elgin and is now at the British Museum. Cyriac was also attracted by the funerary monument of Philopappus, erected on the hill of the Museion. He drew its elevation and transcribed 5 inscriptions, 2 of which, engraved on the right side of the monuments, disappeared after the collapse of the corresponding pillar. Thanks to him, their content is still known. The inscriptions identified Philopappus himself, his royal ancestors, and his civic and Roman offices. Going back to the eastern side of the Acropolis hill, Cyriac crossed Hadrian's Arch and recorded the 2 inscriptions incised on its 2 sides, declaring the boundaries of the city of Theseus and of that of the Roman emperor. The text appears both in Moroni's volume and in the Hamilton manuscript, here with an autograph, interlineary Latin translation. A few steps away from there, he moved to the Olympion, the temple of Olympian Zeus, completed by Hadrian. Cyriac, interestingly, called it the Domus Hadriani, so the Palace of Hadrian. He thought it was Hadrian's palace because in front of it he saw 8 statue bases dedicated to the emperor. None of them has survived, and they're all known only through his records. The text of the Commentaria also recalls that the temple still stood with 21 columns connected by their epistyles. I wonder if the restoration and the anastylosis that is taking place now is considered in these drawings. Probably yes. However, as is the case for all Athenian monuments, Moroni's edition does not include an image of the building, but only the indication deest icon. So the image was missing in the exemplar from which the edition was taken. Fortunately, the drawing is applied both by the Hamilton manuscript, where it is in Cyriac's own hand, and by Sangallo's sketchbook. Finally, one might say, Cyriac came towards where we are right now. He walked 1 mile from the ancient city walls, climbed the first slopes of Mount Lycabettus, and encountered the arch and colonnade of the Roman aqueduct, which was begun by Hadrian and completed by Antoninus Pius. The monument stood in front of its surviving cistern in the modern Plataea Exameni. In the 17th and 18th centuries, it was still partially visible and was drawn by several European travelers, but it was definitively destroyed in 1772. Its few remains now lie rather hidden and neglected in the National Gardens near the Parliament. Robert and I found. So it is now time to draw some conclusions. I hope that the world tour of Athens, as seen by Cyriac in 1436, which we have taken together in the second part of my presentation, has conveyed something of his work and methodology and of the potential that still lies in what survives of his Commentaria. A few Sundays ago, Robert Pitt and I strolled around Athens, holding in our hands Moroni's book and an extraordinary map of Athens drawn by Bodnar in 1960. It was a wonderful experience, and it would be a great pleasure to repeat it one day, perhaps with a British school audience. The possibility of adopting a topographical approach has been perhaps the greatest opportunity and the most significant outcome of my research here in Athens. After all, Cyriac's own practice reminds us that there is no substitute for the direct observation of monuments and sites. In this perspective, my current work forms part of a broader epistemological reframing of epigraphy as the study of the life cycle of inscriptions, epigraphic situation, and epigraphic devices, with the aim of reconstructing the biography of each inscribed object from its present location back to the original context for which it was created. To achieve this, it is essential to clarify how, when, and where inscriptions were used and reused, for instance, as spolia or as components of antiquarian collections. The creation of forgeries, for which Cyriac has also been credited, is, in my view, nothing more than a byproduct of this wider phenomenon. The other aspect that I've come to appreciate with greater clarity during my stay here is that any ambitious project on Cyriac of Ancona must necessarily be interdisciplinary, bringing into conversation Greek and Latin epigraphy, archaeology and topography, together with the history of the Eastern Mediterranean and Renaissance studies. Only such an integrated perspective can adequately convey both the complexity and the limitations of this remarkable figure. The philological achievements of Bodnar, which continue to be indispensable, now require reassessment in the light of the new evidence at our disposal. For this reason, I believe it essential to return to the manuscript tradition, which is why in the opening part of my presentation, I sought to reconstruct the history of the transmission of the Commentaria. Only through such an approach can the circulation of Cyriac's work emerge with clarity, together with a fuller sense of its impact. In a masterly study on Cyriac written in Latin at the end of the 19th century, possibly his finest biography to date, Giovanni Battista de Rossi observed with a note of almost despairing candor that no one had ever seen the exemplar of the Commentaria used by the Barberini editor. Although this manuscript has not yet come to light, and perhaps never will, reconstructing the history of the transmission of the Commentaria enables us to assemble many pieces of the puzzle, including the still insufficiently studied copy of Scalamonti's Vita Cyriaci preserved across the road in the Gennadius Library. It is in this spirit that I very much hope that my engagement with Cyriac and with Athens will continue. Thank you for your attention.